public programme lectures of this term, so we're finishing on a high note. This is actually also the last lecture of the AA Collections and AA XX100 series. The AA Collections, we've been trying to put on lectures. It's really consists of the AA Library and the AA Archives and the AA Photo Library, and basically trying to promote scholarship of our collections. The AA XX100 is a series of events that is leading up to a major exhibition and publication in 2017, which celebrates 100 years since women were admitted to the AA back in 1917. So this is the last of this academic year. Do keep your eyes open for next academic year's lectures. We'll be publishing them in the next couple of months, I should imagine. The subject for today's lecture is the immediate post-war era at the AA, and more specifically, the climate of student activism, really, in that period. And as I'm sure you're all aware, there are a great many books and articles which allude or refer to the significance of a post-war kind of golden generation of architects to come out of the AA. But there's actually been very little published, very little hard archive-based research published about the formative environment in which these architects were trained here at the AA. So I want to introduce a good friend of mine, Patrick Zamarian, who I'm hoping will remedy this situation tonight and maybe challenge a few myths that have grown up over the years as well. Patrick is a qualified architect. He graduated at the ETH in Zurich and holds an MA with distinction in history and theory of architecture. He's currently in his third year of PhD at Liverpool University under the professorship of under the supervision of Professor Mark Swennerton and Barnabas Calder. Alongside his academic studies, Patrick has worked in Berlin on film production and has been for many years a freelance writer for many Swiss and German magazines. And for those of you who've seen his focused and strategic approach to his research, it'll come as no surprise to learn that Patrick is actually a world-class poker player, having represented Switzerland in the 2008 Poker Championships, World Championships, and reached the last 2%, I think. So with no further ado, I want to hand over to Patrick, and hope you enjoy the evening. Patrick's happy to answer questions at the end. And of course, we've got some display of material here from the AA Library and Archives and Photo Library, which we hope you'll find relevant and interesting to the talk. Thank you, Patrick.
Oh, here we go. Well, it gives me great pleasure to be here today. As Ed mentioned in his introduction, my PhD thesis at the University of Liverpool centers upon the AA in the post-war era, and I could not possibly do this research were it not for the generous way in which the AA allows me access to its archives and the kind willingness of many of your members to share their insights and recollections with me. I owe a particularly great debt to Ed Bottoms, who is just about the most pleasant and proficient archivist one can hope to work with. So thank you, and thank you all for coming. We are here today to talk about the students and their activities at the AA in the first post-war decade. And when I say student activities, I refer to those activities that had an impact on the educational setup at the AA. So I'm not going to talk about their politics or social events such as the famous pantomimes or theater plays, fascinating though they may be. The AA was incorporated in 1920, and for the next 50 years, it was controlled and supervised by the AA Council, which put a director or a principal or both in charge of the school. In other words, the students never actually chose their principal, much less did they run the school themselves. This is a popular and surprisingly persistent misconception, perpetuated, it seems, by those who campaigned so vigorously on the students' behalf in the late 1930s. I thought I'd mention this at the beginning of my talk, hoping that by the time I'm finished, it's almost forgotten and I won't get into too much trouble for shattering this myth. That being said, up until 1939, when they were disenfranchised, the students were full members of the association and as such had a direct say in council elections and referenda. My talk this evening will cover some of the various activities they unfolded from the end of the Second World War until they got their voting rights reinstated in a limited form in 1956. I have divided my presentation into 3 short chapters, and these 3 chapters correspond with the tenures of the 3 principals who were in charge of the school. Gordon Brown immediately after the war, Robert Fernell Jordan between 1949 and 1951, and Michael Patrick from 1951 onward. The principle of the AA was without question the single most important factor in determining the educational approach of the school. So although my talk today will focus on the students, we clearly cannot separate them from the principal with whom or against whom they cooperated. Incidentally, each of these 3 post-war principles was faced with a rather different student body in terms of numbers, social makeup, and age structure, and I will try to show how this in turn affected the character of the school. Now, before we turn to the post-war years, I should perhaps briefly summarize the events which occurred at the AA in the second half of the 1930s, because these events, or rather the students' perception of these events, provided much of the stimulus for their activities after the war. The better known aspect of these turbulent years at the AA was a fundamental disagreement over the educational system itself, personified on the one hand by the Director of Education, Harry Goodhart Randall, who favored an intrinsically aestheticist Beaux-Arts approach, and on the other hand, the principal, E.A.A. Rouse, who promoted a sociological modernist approach which involved group working and the legendary unit system. This part of the story is, I believe, commonly known, not least because it gave birth to the famous Report of Students Subcommittee on the School System, better known as the Yellow Book, and subsequently the no less famous student magazine Focus, whose editors, Anthony Cox, Leo de Silas, and Tim Bennett, recorded these events for posterity, if not entirely without bias. As you certainly know, the students won the fight for the unit system, but it was a Pyrrhic victory because at the same time they had to forfeit their voting rights. On some occasions, the students had used the advantage of being permanently present on AA premises to turn votes in their favor, although they were vastly outnumbered by the wider membership. The Board of Education simply was not prepared to recognize and give financial support to a school whose policy was subjected to the influence of its students, and made it perfectly clear that it would not, quote, agree to the students continuing to have any voice in the council, unquote. Since both recognition and financial support were vital for the survival of the AA school, there was in fact very little the council could have done to resist the board's directive, even if they wanted to, which on the whole they didn't. The simultaneity of these 2 events, the assault on the unit system and the abolition of the student vote, invited a reading which saw the 2 as 2 inextricably linked narratives of a revolutionary, strands of a revolutionary narrative. I must say that the archival evidence raises some doubts as to the accuracy of this account, but this is not important in our context. What is important is that it nurtured this self-conception of AA students as an inherently progressive body, almost inevitably opposed to such authoritarian and hopelessly backward institutions as the Board of Education, also the RIBA, and most notably their own council. This notion clearly resonated with the mature and self-assertive servicemen who returned after the war to resume or begin their studies at the AA, and this now brings us to the main topic of our talk this evening. Our story begins in January 1945, when the school returned from its wartime exile in Barnet, Hertfordshire, and rejoined the association in Bedford Square. 2 years prior, the government had launched so-called further education and training grants, FET grants, which covered the tuition fees and maintenance allowance of military personnel whose education had been interrupted or suspended by the war. As a result, a large number of ex-servicemen who could not otherwise have afforded it took up or continued their training at the AA. The council anticipated that the running of an overcrowded school in war-battered premises would, at least initially, raise organizational rather than educational problems. It was with this in mind that they appointed as their principal and successor to Frederick Gibbard, a 32-year-old parachute major called Gordon Brown, who had studied at the AA in the early 1930s, together with Jane Drew, by the way, but had little practical experience as an architect and no teaching experience whatsoever. The picture at the top gives us an idea of the crowded conditions at the AA. These were, in fact, even more dramatic than in other schools in the country, because the AA not only pledged to readmit all its former students immediately upon their release from the services, but it also ran a number of refresher courses for American GIs stationed in Britain. And Brown, who, as a military man, was clearly sympathetic to this brand of students, handled the intake of new applicants very liberally. Between July 1944 and October 1946, the number of students tripled from 106 to 325, and it eventually peaked 2 years later at 535, roughly twice the pre-war number. The slide shows this large Nissen hut and the two smaller Ministry of Works huts, which were erected on a bomb site here on Morwell Street, and which accommodated an additional 120 students. The remainder of the plot was turned into a practical training site for students, quite a novelty in architectural education at the time. Apart from a growing contingent of ex-servicemen, there were, of course, those who had started their course at Barnet, as well as a small number of teenage students entering directly from school, and the result was a very diverse student body indeed. First, there were class differences. Apart from a few scholarship holders, almost all AA students had previously come from an upper class background. With the ex-servicemen who came on FET grants, this was not the case, or at least not to that extent. One of these students was John Cordwell, who you can see here pictured on the left. Cordwell had started his education before the war at the LCC-run Regent Street Polytechnic, now part of Westminster University. In 1940, he volunteered for Bomber Command, was shot down over Belgium, and spent the next 4 years in a German prisoner of war camp. When he resumed his studies at the AA after the war, he clearly had little patience for those who he suspected, or whose social background he suspected may have saved them from a similar fate. Cordwell's contemptuous remarks about his fellow students who talk too much in their affected accents were probably not representative of the views of the majority of ex-servicemen, but they clearly reflected the feelings of a small and vocal group. Cordwell, by the way, went on to have a very distinguished career. After graduating in 1947 with an honours diploma, he briefly worked for the LCC before managing projects for Fry and Drew in Africa. And in the early 50s, he moved to the United States, where he eventually became Chief Planning Officer of Chicago. So there were class differences, and there were, secondly, age differences. For the sake of fairness, service personnel were demobilized according to their age and length of service, and as a result, the older students generally came back first. Having lost a good part of their youth to the war, these moth-eaten old students, as one year master called them, were understandably eager to qualify as quickly as possible. They were forcing the pace and appeared to have been very intolerant to the irritations caused by teenage students. When Brown, due to staff shortages, tried to involve senior students in the tutoring of the first year and asked them to serve on crits, they simply refused to do so. Not only that, supported by Brown, they requested to be completely separated from the younger students in a different part of the building, which, however, founded on the resistance of second-year master John Brandon Jones, who simply wasn't prepared to run his course like that. Quote, I called them up, servicemen first, which were about 3/4, if not more. Then I called up the schoolboys, and there were about 2. So I said, well, if you can't put up with 2 noisy little schoolboys, I don't think much of you. So that settled it, unquote. These age discrepancies were, thirdly and most problematically, exacerbated by a gender difference. As one would expect, the returning ex-servicemen were predominantly male, although not exclusively. The slide shows a picture of Jacqueline Comey, a lieutenant with the French army, who was quite likely the most highly decorated student at the AA at the time. She was the recipient of the Légion d'honneur with military cross, the highest accolade in military accolade in France, awarded only for extreme bravery in the field. To put it bluntly, you usually have to die to get it, which she almost did. Nonetheless, in their majority, these ex-servicemen were male and in the late 20s, early 30s. Those who transferred for Barnet were mostly women and in the late teens, early 20s. In order to fill the places in the school, the council had, for the duration of the war, allowed an intake of 50% women, despite Gibbett's concerns that many of them had no real conception of what the architectural profession holds for them. Due to the earlier call-up for men, this 50% intake often resulted in a slight preponderance of women over men, most notably in the senior years. Many of these young women found it very difficult to adapt to the new fast-paced conditions in Bedford Square, and several of them could not stand the strain and had nervous breakdowns. In light of this, Brown in November 1945 urged the council to raise the entry age of women from 17 to 19, which they declined because demobilization was slower than expected and the school could not financially afford to reject applicants merely on the basis of their sex. However, as soon as there were sufficient male candidates, the council reverted to the pre-war arrangement of allowing only 20% women students. By mid-1946, a significant reduction of women had been achieved, and in September, the ratio was, as you can see on this table there, 3:1, equivalent to the overall ratio at English universities. In fact, by limiting the actual intake of women to approximately 10%, the figure was dropped to a ratio of 4:1 within a year. In other words, in the late 1940s, the ratio of female students was considerably lower at the AA than at the average university, which I suspect may come as a bit of a surprise. The student demographic had a profound impact on the way the school operated. Given the sheer number of students and corresponding staff shortages, the first thing Gordon Brown did, was forced to do really, was to abolish the treasured unit system, which prompted the Students' Committee to resign in protest. To make matters worse, Brown also introduced a new, more highly organized tutorial system, requiring students and teachers to work to a precise time schedule, which was of course very much at odds with the informal mechanisms customary at the AA. Nonetheless, this did not mean that Brown ran the AA like an army unit, as has sometimes been claimed, because staff shortages were such that students were allocated merely 12 minutes individual tutorial per week, and for the rest of the time they appear to have been essentially unsupervised and free to do whatever they liked. This sense of liberty suited these more mature students, as they were neither in need of nor indeed prepared to accept top-to-bottom instruction in a traditional sense, particularly since many of their tutors were barely older than themselves and perhaps not insignificantly so soon after the war of lower or no military rank. To the despair of some tutors, such as Henry Cadbury Brown, who felt that the students were getting much too uppity, many of them took advantage of the situation by sidelining the given programs and working on subjects of their own choosing, as well as by experimenting with the design process itself. The most notable outcome of this was the resurgence of group work. Whether this was really instigated by the students themselves, as Oliver Cox later claimed, is difficult to say with certainty. It is clear that at least some of the staff, particularly fourth-year master David Goddard, was supportive of the idea of group working, and Gordon Brown, as a matter of principle, did not interfere with the course planning of his year masters. You remember my showing you John Cordwell with one of these group schemes a few minutes ago, and this slide here shows another 2 examples. The first one is a project for Penguin books done by a large group which included Gardner Knight as well as Peter Dickinson, who went on to have a very successful but very short, sadly, career in Canada. And the other image shows the project for a new opera, one of many group schemes done by Michael and Lois Ventris, Oliver Cox, and Graham Shankland. Ventris, Shankland, and Cox were all members of the so-called Education Subcommittee, a very active section of the Students' Committee, formed to liaise directly with the principal on educational matters. In fact, their activities were by no means confined to the AA, as they made a concerted effort to take command of the countrywide Architectural Students Association, ArcSA. The ArcSA, the first of its kind in the world, had its roots in a regional association of northern schools, specifically Manchester, Liverpool, and Newcastle, which had started to expand southwards during the war. Initially, this happened without any AA involvement, but this changed after the war. And in April 1947, the Students' Committee sent a 14-strong delegation to the annual RKSA Congress in Brighton, where, according to Oliver Cox, they wrested the entire thing from Northern, which is precisely what they did. The Students' Committee underlined its ambitions by organizing a fully packed two-week program of events in connection with the AA centenary in December 1947, which famously culminated in a talk by Le Corbusier, who had previously rejected an invitation by the AA Council itself. In March 1948 followed the publication of the Mars RKSA interim report on architectural education, which appears to have been largely the work of Anthony Cox on behalf of the Mars Group and Graham Shankland representing the AA Education Subcommittee. The report caused quite a stir at the time due to its overt criticism of the RIBA. Perhaps the most resounding outcome of the AA students' control over the RKSA, however, was their editorship of its magazine Plan, which they modeled or remodeled on focus and produced between 1948 and 1951. We will return to Plan in just a moment. The evidence as to how this increasing student involvement resonated with Gordon Brown is inconsistent, to say the least. On the whole, the impression is that he was rather happy to let things go their own way, as long as this didn't threaten to undermine his authority. However, when it did, he could be ruthless, and one third-year student, who was the secretary of the RKSA at the time, was in fact expelled from the school for unspecified insubordination, as he recalls. It did not prevent him from receiving the RIBA gold medal some years later, which I think is quite comforting in a way, and has clearly hope for those of us who didn't attend the AA. Now, to be fair to Gordon Brown, there were many occasions when he actively supported the students' activities, and I know that not all of them would agree with Oliver Cox, who remembered him as that dismal figure who succeeded Gibbard. There was no such ambiguity, however, with regard to his successor, Robert Fernell Jordan, who took over as principal in January 1949 and who unreservedly embraced and in fact actively encouraged the students' rebelliousness. Jordan had joined the AA teaching staff in 1934 and soon became part of Rouse's inner circle. He was an architect and design tutor, but his greatest impact was as a lecturer in architectural history. The concluding and by far most substantial paragraph in the Yellow Book suggested changes to the teaching of architectural history, which clearly show Jordan's influence. Therefore, to students in the late 1940s, Jordan represented a direct link to the legendary pre-war period. Their expectations were accordingly high, and they were not misplaced. If there's one common thread running through the many conversations I've had with former AA students, it really is their unqualified admiration for Robert Fernell Jordan. Without wishing to diminish Jordan's accomplishment, one must say that he did benefit from particularly favorable circumstances. Jordan took charge of the school at a moment when its post-war reconstruction phase had been completed and the respective expenditures paid off. The Nissen hut, which I showed you earlier, was originally intended only as an emergency measure, but now turned out to be an immensely profitable investment, as it allowed consistently high student numbers. Due to the steady flow of income through tuition fees, the AA school found itself in a rare state of affluence, which allowed Jordan to realize his ideas with comparably few financial constraints. One prominent feature of his term in office were these lavish prize-giving ceremonies and the presence of distinguished foreign visitors to the school. In 1950, Frank Lloyd Wright, who's the third from the left on the top picture, Frank Lloyd Wright was the guest of honor, and in the previous year, the Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, gave out prizes to students. You can see Attlee here in between Robert Furner-Jordan and Henry Braddock, the AA president. And many of you will, without doubt, recognize this young man as well. That's Bob Maguire, who studied under all three AA principles and did exceptionally well under all of them. Another remarkable aspect of Jordan's tenure was the fact that he dealt with a surprisingly homogeneous student body. The large table shows the number of students classified by course and age groups in 1950. You can see that there's an increasing concentration of mid-20-year-olds there. A few years earlier, this would have been a much more diverse picture. The more revealing figure, however, is at the bottom. You remember that in 1947, the women ratio was 4:1, so women made up 20% of students at the AA. By 1950, that number had further dropped to slightly over 10% for the course as a whole, and only 5% for first-year students. The figures for the council and staff underline just how male an environment the AA was in the post-war years. Between 1944 and 1956, 62 different people were elected to the AA council. Out of these, only 2, so just over 3%, were women. Susan Babington Smith, the future wife of Anthony Cox, served until 1950 and was very much the students' voice on the council. She was the only one who protested vigorously against the abolition of the unit system in 45, and 2 years later she supported an effort by the students to have the question of the student vote reconsidered by the council, both times in vain. Between 1950 and 1955, Barbara Price, an architect with the Ministry of Education, was a member of the council. And in addition to these two, there was also, in 1947, Mrs. Howard Robertson, who, as the president's wife, was co-opted rather than elected to the AA Council to help with the preparations for the AA centenary. In terms of studio staff, the situation was even more one-sided. In the same period, between 1944 and 1956, only 2 out of approximately 120 studio staff were women, so less than 2%. Elizabeth King was briefly a year master under Brown, and Elizabeth Chesterton was a unit master from the mid-1950s onward. In the 7 years between 1947 and 1954, there wasn't a single woman on the studio staff. The fact that Jordan also purged his staff of the more traditional and generally slightly older elements, such as Brandon Jones or first-year master Eric Jarrett, meant that the school as a whole was as homogeneous as it could possibly be. Students and teachers were predominantly male, more or less in the same age bracket, and generally sharing the same progressive modernist outlook. All of this meant that the tensions of the Brown years were clearly a thing of the past, which made it easier for Jordan to realize his ambition of running the AA school as a cooperative effort between the various stakeholders. Jordan collaborated closely with the students and merged our education subcommittee into an influential staff-student committee, thereby reviving the tradition of staff-student meetings, which in the 1930s had given birth to the Yellow Book. Moreover, Jordan extended group working, which under Brown had been limited to senior years, over the entire course and made it the core element not only of the educational but also of the administrative machinery at the AA school. Jordan invited his students to form themselves into groups which remained in being even if the students themselves chose to tackle their projects as individuals, which incidentally didn't happen very often. Each of these permanent groups elected a chairman who represented them in fixed weekly meetings with the respective year staff. Effectively, this gave students a recognized standing and voice in the running of the school, although of course not the association itself. As a result of this close collaboration between Jordan, the students, and the staff, an unprecedented sense of unity appears to have permeated the AA in the late 1940s, fondly remembered by many of those who attended the AA at the time. A unique and short-lived feature of Jordan's course was that final thesis too were regularly done in groups, and the slide shows one of 2 particularly ambitious examples submitted in 1950 by Hugh Morris, John Killick, Bill Howell, Jill Sarson, and Stephen McFarland. It's a great privilege to have Stephen with us today. He's made the effort to come over to Bristol, and I'm very flattered, although he'll probably get up at the end of my talk and say I've got it all wrong. But Stephen's group took the existing plan for Stevenage New Town as a starting point and developed one of the proposed 6 neighborhood units by combining single-story houses with a number of high-rises. In doing so, they arrived at densities that were incompatible with the original plan, which induced them to reconceive the town as a whole. The second example shows the famous zone thesis by Pat Crook, John Volker, and Andrew Derbyshire. Unlike the Stevenage thesis, which was a critical response to the New Town program, but did not question the underlying thinking itself, the zone thesis was an explicit critique of prevailing urban theory. The scheme was the result of a 2-year collaborative effort between the 3 students and proposed a self-sufficient microregion for 72,000 inhabitants, consisting of a city core surrounded and supported by a network of farming communities. Both these groups, the Stevenage group and the Zone group, were very influential within the AA through the brilliance of their work, but also because they formed the core of the editorial team responsible for the later issues of Plan. It is, I think, quite revealing to compare these with the earlier ones. The 3 numbers that were produced when Brown was the principal, especially one on group working, can be interpreted as a partial critique of the existing course and an attempt to promote these new methods which were being tried on an experimental basis and which the leaders of that student generation, Oliver Cox, Michael Ventris, etc., thought worth supporting. So they had a subversive aspect to them, very much in the tradition of focus. The later issues, on the other hand, were a reflection rather than a critique of Jordan's approach. Dissatisfaction with the reality of new town planning, the inefficiency of the building industry and the need for prefabrication, praise for the Hertfordshire schools as an exemplar for this desired integration of architecture, building and society. These were all topics which put Plan at the forefront of architectural thinking in Britain at the time, but which were entirely in line with progressive AA thought. In other words, unlike Focus, Plan was not so much a platform from which to voice the students' dissent with current AA policy, but rather a medium to disseminate the basic principles of this policy to a wider audience. And the same can be said about the Architectural Student Association itself. By the end of the 1940s, the AA had gained almost complete control over the RCSA, which in effect turned the AA Students' Committee into an organization of national standing. In April 1949, it organized the first ever International Architectural Students' Conference at the RIBA, and at the annual RCSA Congress in Oxford in July, the AA delegates put forward a 14-point circular on education as basis for discussion. The so-called 14 points, which had originally been published as an editorial in Plan, reflected either current or envisaged AA practice and called for things such as cross-year group working, substitution of formal lectures by free discussion, and control of the school curriculum by joint student staff committees. At the annual Congress in the following year, the RCSA delegates passed the final resolution which incorporated key elements of the AA's 14-point proposal and turned it thus into official RCSA policy. What all this boils down to is that by 1950, the students of the AA had by and large realized the ambitions of their pre-war predecessors. They had a direct voice in the running of the school, and through Plan and the RCSA, their ideas spread to a national, even international audience. Yet unfortunately, these wonder years, as I've called them in my title, didn't last long. By mid-1950, political controversies began to poison the climate within the AA, resulting in June 1951 in the more or less forced resignation of Robert Furneaux Jordan. Simultaneously, the AA's run as Plan editors came to an end, whilst an ambitious but badly planned student program in connection with the Festival of Britain left the RCSA in irrecoverable debt, which led to its dissolution soon after. Events in the wider world contributed to the students' growing sense of frustration. The Tory victory in the general election confounded any hope for a socialist Britain, and the implementation of drastic building cuts meant that for the first time since the war, there was a decline in building production and therefore employment prospects for young architects. In other words, within a few months, things started to go seriously wrong for AA students. And then, to add insult to injury, Michael Patrick took over as principal of the school. Now, Michael Patrick, like Gordon Brown and Fernand Jordan before him, was an AA graduate. In fact, and here's a rather surprising fact, he was the most successful AA student I have come across in the course of my research. In his 5 years at the AA in the mid-1930s, he won 3 first prizes, 1 second, and he was the AA's candidate for the Rome Scholarship in 2 consecutive years. Brown hired Michael Patrick as a tutor in 1946, and after Jordan's departure, he was the most senior member of the teaching staff. As such, he was, of course, well known in the school and, by all accounts, exceedingly unpopular with at least the more vocal faction of students. The choice of Michael Patrick as interim principal in June 1951 caused great concerns with the Students' Committee, and on the first day of the new academic year, it gathered the students for a protest rally, including a first-year student, Peter Ahrens, who had just arrived from South Africa and recalls a sense of excitation, which was immediately inclusive. At a subsequent meeting, the students passed a resolution demanding Jordan's involvement in developing the present educational approach further, and an assurance from the council that it would not appoint Michael Patrick on a permanent basis. The council, needless to say, did so anyway, and Patrick's initial actions as principal confirmed the fears of those who anticipated that his appointment would spell the end of Jordan's educational policy. First of all, Michael Patrick severely restricted group working, which he only allowed in exceptional circumstances. Moreover, he put an end to the appointment of foreign tutors and guest lecturers. He introduced more rigorous entrance procedures, and he drastically increased the number of relegations and expulsions. In fairness to Michael Patrick, one must say that the virtual abolition of group working was due to unambiguous interference on the part of the RIBA, whilst the other measures were largely dictated by changing circumstances. In 1951, the last FET grant-aided students entered the AA, whilst the lease for the Morwell Street site ran out. And as a consequence, the AA had to implement a policy of reduced numbers and therefore reduced income. In light of this, it is frankly difficult to see how Jordan could have avoided similarly unpopular measures, but the fact remains that under Patrick, the AA was quickly turning into a very different school indeed. Unsurprisingly, the first few months of Patrick's tenure was strained by disharmony between himself on the council on one side and the students on the other. The Students' Committee organized a series of meetings to express their dissatisfaction with the school and its leadership, and in March 1953, the students passed an almost unanimous vote of no confidence in the principal and put a request to the council to consider a new appointment. One of the ringleaders in the Students' Committee at the time was John Winter, and I think his short altercation with Hugh Casson illustrates just how confrontational the relations between the students and the school authorities have become. Casson and other members of the council were fully prepared to expel the entire Students' Committee for disobeying their orders on a number of occasions, but with people such as Oliver Cox and Graham Shanklin newly elected to the council, there was sufficient opposition to such drastic measures. Interestingly, Patrick himself threatened the students with disciplinary action, but did in fact oppose it in council meetings. It didn't help, and the situation came to a climax in June 1953 when the Students' Committee presented a so-called report on recent events in the school and suggestions toward a new policy, with the intention to circulate it to the membership. As the dual title indicates, the document was a peculiar hybrid. Its main body was inspired by the Yellow Book and contained a number of suggestions toward a new policy, including the creation of an editorial board for the AA Journal consisting of members and students, the reintroduction of the unit system, and most notably, the restoration of the student vote. However, in addition to these constructive proposals, the report also featured a preamble and an appendix on recent events in the school, whose main purpose it was to launch a scathing attack on the principal. While Patrick and the council were prepared to consider the constructive proposals contained in the report, they categorically refused to discuss, let alone publish, the inflammatory appendix, not least because Michael Patrick threatened to sue for libel if they did. As you can see at this point, even a sympathetic and even-tempered council member such as Peter Shepherd started to become rather irritated with the students' defiant attitude. Unwilling to withdraw the contentious sections of their report, the Students' Committee eventually resigned again. The report remained unpublished, and the quarrels which had kept the AA in suspense for almost 2 years appeared to peter out with no tangible result whatsoever. Yet the controversy had its aftermath, and it was, in a way, a feast of irony. The attempt to have Patrick removed, the prime purpose of the students' report, was of course a total failure. Once the last of Jordan's students had left the school, Patrick settled into his role very successfully and managed to hang on to his post longer than any other principal before him. The constructive proposals, on the other hand, although of secondary importance to the students themselves, remained on the agenda of the authorities. In July 1954, Patrick, who had himself experienced the unit system as a student and was not averse to it, reintroduced it in a slightly altered form. And half a year later, the council implemented the students' suggestions regarding the AA journal and created an editorial board headed by John Killick, who had, of course, been one of the editors of Plan. Kenneth Frampton was one of the students who initially served on this board. Most importantly, the report, or rather the controversy surrounding the report, reignited the debate about the students' voting rights. And in July 1953, the council agreed to work towards a restoration of the student vote, at least in part with a view to appeasing the agitated student body. In November 1953, the council entered protracted legal negotiations with the Ministry of Education and the Board of Trade, and it was largely due to the persistence of Peter Shepherd, who was now the president of the AA, that by the end of 1955, the parties eventually arrived at a compromise whereby students would have the right to nominate as many candidates for the council as they wished, but would only be entitled to vote for 2 of them. Some members who had hoped for a complete restoration of the pre-1939 situation, including Shepherd himself, were slightly disappointed with this proposal, but it was generally accepted that under the circumstances it was the best outcome that could be achieved. The council remained skeptical whether the wider membership would in fact support their proposal, but these concerns proved entirely unfounded because when the result of the postal ballot came in, a vast majority of members had voted in favor of the student vote. Now, we've started our journey today with the loss of the student vote at the beginning of 1939, and we shall end it with the return of the student vote in May 1956. I hope I've managed to convey a sense of the way in which the interplay of students, principal, and council affected the developments at the AA in the first decade after the war. I think it's important to realize that the 3 post-war principles not only differed markedly from each other, but they were also confronted with very different conditions, specifically in terms of the size, social makeup, and age structure of the student body. Gordon Brown dealt with a diverse and fast increasing student population. Fernand Jordan's school, on the other hand, was decidedly more homogeneous. Students and staff were roughly the same age, predominantly male, and the numbers were consistently high. Michael Patrick's takeover coincided with the end of the FET grants, meaning that within a year, the average age of first-year students dropped from 24 to 18, and the school gradually returned to its pre-war size. The unprecedented activism of the post-war students was inspired, supported, and perhaps incited by the pre-war insurgents, whose Yellow Book and focus appeared to set an unreachable benchmark. Ironically, in a seemingly futile attempt to pick up the pre-war initiatives and match the achievements of their predecessors, the post-war students in many ways surpassed these. In the late 1940s, and particularly under Jordan, the students had a greater part in shaping their own education than they had in the 1930s. And through the dominance of the RKSA, and specifically their editorship of Plan, they managed to spread their ideas wider and in a more sustained fashion than had been possible before the war. These things came to an abrupt end in 1951, and the quarrels which marked Patrick's early years in office reflected a profound sense of disillusion amongst those whose outlook was conditioned by the promise of the immediate post-war years. The return of the unit system and the restoration of the students' voting rights were their legacy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Fascinating tour. I've learned so much from that, and it's wonderful to see all the kind of delving into the figures and the statistics, the demographics, which have a key impact, I'm sure, as you brought out. Yeah, just wondering if anybody has any questions. We've got a microphone flying around. Who's going to ask the first question? Maybe if I can put one initially. I've always been uncertain about Ferno Jordan's departure. What was the background to the political kind of aspect of his?
I think it's an accumulation of various factors which led to Robert Ferno Jordan's departure. There were politically motivated controversies at the AA from the mid-1950s onward. Specifically, there was a disagreement with his fourth-year master, David Goddard. Essentially, Jordan sacked Goddard, and Goddard claimed that he had become the victim of a politically or communist conspiracy, basically. This was one thing, and shortly after, there was, through a man called Winston Walker, who was an AA member, he basically accused Jordan of hiring his staff merely on the basis of their political opinions. And the AA, both the council and Jordan, reacted to these allegations in a rather naive way. They underestimated the sort of potential such accusations could have, and it led, amongst other things, to potential donors withdrawing their pledges for donations, including Bannister Fletcher, but other donors as well. So it started to have financial impact on the AA. In addition, Jordan overspent massively. Although he had a lot of money at his disposal, it's documented, and that he brought the finance committee of the AA in severe trouble. So there was something building up against Ferno Jordan, and I cannot prove it with archival evidence, but I have it from quite reliable sources that there was a conspiracy led by Hugh Casson to get Jordan out of the office. And obviously all this had an impact on Jordan, who was of frail health anyway, and who certainly wasn't a tough, couldn't take these allegations, and I think it really affected his health. In the end, he resigned for health reasons. But obviously there was a story behind it. In addition, his brother died at just that time as well. So I think it was all just getting too much for him. But that's my take on it. It's a variety of factors. Yeah. And depending on who you ask, some will be more important than others.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
Patrick, you won't be surprised that I want to ask you a question about. You won't be surprised to know that I want to ask you a question about women at the AA.
I can honestly tell you, I've told you everything I know. But go ahead.
No, it's okay. It's just that, I mean, you describe, interestingly, you describe a kind of Rosie the Architect effect that post-war period women were squeezed out of the AA, which is really interesting. And, you know, hopefully we can look in, you know, AAXX 100 could look into that a bit more about the details of why that happened. And you also cited Jacqueline Crombie as having won the Croix de Guerre. On the other hand, the post-war students, you said several had nervous breakdowns because they couldn't stand the stress of coming back to Bedford Square. I suppose I want to ask, how do we know this? But also, it doesn't really jive with you were talking about pre-war, 1930s women, 1920s women, 1910s women, when they sort of prospered at the AA. So how do do you account for that
I think
stress of it?
I think first of all the situations, the conditions were rather unique at the AA immediately after the war. I mean, we have people here who studied there, and I mean, these were crowded, very crowded conditions in war-battered premises, and coming from this idyllic Mount House in Barnet, I think it just was a shock to, well, I don't think so, I know it because it's documented in the council minutes and school committee minutes. That was the reason why Gordon Brown asked for the entry age to be raised. So these are documented cases of young, in the early 20s, late teens, girls having nervous breakdown.
I wonder, though, if we should take that report of the committee minutes literally. I just counsel that to not, nervous breakdown is a very specific or rather general thing, and it's can be applied with a kind of gendered perspective. Mm-hmm. So I think we should not perhaps go with that just on the basis of council minutes. It may be a time when documentation doesn't always tell the truth. It may, but on the other hand,
I can see your point, but for lack of alternative sources, yep. I think it's the most reliable one.
Okay, well, I think that's a challenge.
Stephen.
I think thank you. Is it needed that I would like to congratulate the speaker for illuminating the ethos of the golden age that I inhabited here, and how it was dismembered or broken down, and the nuances of what was actually happening were completely outside my awareness at the time as a schoolboy. One of the not noisy little schoolboys, but a rather serious and a schoolboy who was very much enthralled to those older men who came, and what good mentors they were, and what they added to the fabric of the people in the school at that time. And 2 points I'd just like to illuminate, if I may. Jackie Cromie, I remember so well, was on the verge, I think, of a breakdown when she was at the AA in the first year. She was a chain smoker and had obviously been in traumatic circumstances. She did go on to marry one of the fellow students who was a former naval officer. And I don't know what further happened, whether she practiced or not.
I don't think she actually qualified. I know she studied at the AA between 45 and 50, but I don't think she actually achieved the diploma, not to my knowledge anyway.
I know of one other woman, student that I've kept in touch with, who really felt very unhelped by the teaching that she didn't get. She feels she never got a diploma, although she had been right through the 5-year course. I was very upset when I heard very much later, after we were both long retired. But I think the question I want to put to you, because you have tapped the seams of amazing history, recent history, how does the situation that you have now come to chronicle have any lessons or any bearing on how schools of this increased number of schools, how these schools are sort of their governance and their student relationships and the students that they are producing? Are there lessons to be learned, or is there any sort of what can one say, help,
feel slightly not qualified to really answer this question. I wish I could. I think the circumstances after the war, from the end of the war until the early 60s, when the RIBA really started to control architectural education, I think it was a period which allowed schools such as the AA, or the AA, not schools such as just the AA, to experiment so widely with architectural education. And I very much doubt whether in the present system anything like it would be possible. But as I said, I'm not really qualified. Mark would be qualified to answer this question.
With you, which Mark is that?
Yeah, I think the circumstances were very special and probably not easy to repeat in any way by any stretch of imagination.
I do know that the director of the surviving school in Bristol was really very sadly relating to Gina myself, that when I inquired from his students what books they were reading or what books they enjoyed or indeed what books they had read, he was, with every student, they read nothing.
Mm.
No, they all read in Liverpool. They never stop. Yes. Yes. Well, I don't know if it answers the point at all, but the thought that I think comes over very clearly from your presentation is the way in which the students of one generation are motivated and inspired by what they believe happened in a previous generation. When you were talking about the post-war ones, sort of having this sense of having to live up to that immediate pre-war group. And I think that's quite an interesting observation, which does have much wider application, because I think it's a kind of motivating power of myth. And if one group of students feel that their predecessors did something, whether they did it or not, but if that then motivates them, then that is something, a way in which different schools can generate their own trajectory. Now, I think it's quite hard to see in this school at the moment, given the complete change in composition of students post-1971, exactly how that would come back in. But I think one can see that effect where there is more continuity in student recruitment. I think one can sometimes see that effect taking place.
I think that's one of the unique strengths, though, of the AA, that students are not just students, they're also members of the association. So it's sort of, there are so many, typical AA careers where people study at the AA, they qualify, 2 years later they show up on the teaching staff, do it for 5 years, then 2 years later they are members of the AA council. So it's sort of, it's a self-perpetuating system at the AA, certainly more than at other schools, I would think. Yes, Simon?
I was going to say that I think it's necessary sometimes to sort of stand back, pinch yourself, and wonder how unique particular institutions are. I mean, the AA, I have experience of the AA as a student, and not in this period, but in the 1960s. Most of my teaching career has been at the University of Liverpool, but I've taken the opportunity to go back into the records, not of the AA, which I thought I knew, but now I realise I only half knew as a result of your excellent research. But when you look at, I mean, your most recent remarks about how quickly people could morph from being senior students into junior members of staff, and sometimes not just junior members of staff, but on a very rapid trajectory upwards, you will find it replicated in some other schools. Even in the immediate pre-war years, you got in a university like Liverpool, and people like Gordon Stevenson and the man who later became Lord Holford, going out loaded with school prizes and Prix de Rome and things like that, and then reappearing two years later as senior lecturers, not just lecturers, and then being a professor only 2 or 3 years after that. Because we were in a period of interesting growth in various educational systems, I couldn't possibly say what happened in the immediate post-World War II period at Liverpool, but I do know what happened in the post-First World War period, and it sounds remarkably similar to some of what you've been talking about, for reasons that are probably very similar to an older generation of students been through all kinds of different experiences during the war, women as well as men having had different experiences during the war and bringing things. And I can see this as part of a very interesting continuum. I know you can only do so much if you're writing a PhD and keeping your eye on targets and things like that. But I'm making a statement, but it's got a big question mark if people want to take it up. That there is a repeating pattern here in different places, and I suspect if I knew more about it, you could find it happening in other places too. There's certainly a pattern in people drop out of the scene, but then they reappear. Someone like Fernand Jordan, who you've been telling us about, was one of the people who were roped in. They all seem to have been run out of town at one stage, because in the 1960s, when the history program got into difficulty in the AA school, who was dragged out of retirement to help? Robert Fernand Jordan, Joseph Rickworth, and their friend Summerson came over from Lincoln's Inn Fields to lend a hand too. Total chaos, but it was very stimulating, and it stimulated a number of us actually to go into that line of work.
I'd just like to move things in a slightly more positive way about women, because there were women who succeeded where they associated themselves with the men, as tends to happen. So people like Patty Hopkins, Annette Austin-Smith, Joyce Taylor, they have had, Jane Drew. I mean, there's a whole load of women who did exceedingly well where they actually married fellow students. And whilst those who didn't manage to attach themselves ended up being nervous wrecks, a lot of them. But I wondered whether you could say something about the ones who were very successful.
Well, you mentioned the most important ones that I know of. I think one interesting woman, I don't know a lot about her, but is Pat Tyndale, who ended up being the highest architect in the public service. So there were obviously, I never denied that, did I? It's just there weren't that many statistically at the school. That's not to say that those who were there, there are certainly some had successful careers. I would say percentage-wise, no less than man. And Gibbard himself, funny enough, he actually thought that those women who made it through the school, they did remarkably well and they were better than the man. But his reason why he didn't want any more women at the AA was basically because he argued that the building industry was so male-dominated, it's not worth training all these women because the building industry will not absorb them. Because the building industry has these preconceived ideas about women not fitting in. So he basically put the blame on the building industry. And because the AA, the aim of the AA was to train architects for the building market. So they followed this line of and this was not questioned. So they all agreed on that. I think there was one council member. I can't remember his name now. One single council member argued that there should be no restrictions at all. There should be no women quota at all. But there was only one out of 14.
So where was this quota recorded? In the minutes.
Yes.
It's interesting that Jane Drew, I think it was in anyway, before she died, that she wrote a letter of BD where she said actually the biggest hurdles and problems she faced was with fellow architects, and it was fine dealing with contractors in the building industry, and actually it's architects who are the problem, which I think most women will concur with.
Oh, interesting.
I was here, sorry. I was here between 49 and 54. Came as a school. And there were 3 women in our year. As far as I know, they went through the year, the 5 years, just the same as us. I don't remember any problem at all. They were heavily outnumbered, but there was no difference between us as far as I could see. And I haven't got any great insight into the political goings on because as a schoolboy, you know, sort of coming out of the eggshell rather, and not having little chaps who'd been in the war. There was a chap, an American in my group, who had cloned bombers and things during the war. But you know, I was pretty naive and growing up at the same time. So Ching's Yard, where maybe there was revolution for a bit, I never got involved. When I first started, this is just a side issue, I go to the interview upstairs somewhere there, and Robert Furneaux-Jordan and about 14 members of some committee who were going to interview me, fairly daunting. Fortunately, I had with me a small Bugatti model that I'd made, and I saw outside parked a Bentley, a vintage Bentley, and somebody looking like Robertson Justice was one of these chaps who were in the interviewing committee. And as soon as I put it on the table, he said, "Oi, we'll have that down here." And it was scooted down the table. And my memory is that there were about 12 or 13 chaps playing with this car up and down the other end. And Robert Furneaux-Jordan just talking to me, so I was only dealing with him. And he asked me a question like, "Would you know of any modern building?" And I said, I brought out the Bexhill Pavilion. That'll do, you know. So I was in. And so then, okay, it was golden years. I remember it being a marvellous period. Perhaps I was getting a bit jaded. I did the whole thing. I came at 17. I was out at 22. Then I went and did my national service. But the last 2 years, it was beginning to pall. You know, I was getting a bit. I lost the impetus a bit. But yeah, group working was interesting, and the place was fantastic. I don't remember being a, what does it say, a noisy little schoolboy. But anyway, it was unpolitical. But I knew there were rumblings. There was you know, socialist society somewhere down in the underground, stirring things. But it wasn't exactly like you know, fighting the fascists, the phalangers in the Spanish Civil War. Maybe it would have done me a power of good to be thrust into that sort of era, but unfortunately I'd escaped it. Anyway,
Thank you.
as a side issue.
Experience, but I just wonder whether the real outcome of that period, the real outcome, if you like, was the way in which, speaking personally as just one of the students, it must have been one of the formative factors in my development that valued the cooperative process of good teamwork. It's very, very difficult, and I know that I think my firm would have been much, much more profitable had it not decided to go multidiscipline, because there the problem of the communities, with the disparate communities within the building industry, to a degree still exist. but there have been breakthroughs, and one of my best friends among the veterans became a founder of Building Design Partnership with Grenfell Baines. Now that's attempt to get through the sort of Masonic structure of professions, I think was worthwhile, and I'm glad that we certainly did it. And but I all put this down to the early introduction to teamwork that happened in the early days of my career, from 45 to 50.
First of all, I'd like to say I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. Just
But
as a small point of information, you talked about John Caldwell in Chicago. Now, I knew John in Chicago in
Oh, really?
the 60s. I'm not quite sure that he was actually, you referred to him as being the city planner.
Yeah, I think so, yes. I'm referring to an oral history interview that he did with University of Chicago. And yes.
Well, maybe it's not, but when I was there in the 60s, he had his own firm. It was a firm called Solomon and Caldwell. That in the 60s, Chicago was full of ex-AA students. John, I know, passed away, must be 10
99.
10 to 15 years ago. We were over in Chicago last year, and I met his son, who I can remember as a small boy of about 8 years old. He's now about 58, I think. Still living in the same house. But there was just one street just north of the Loop in Chicago, where there were 3 ex-AA students working. John Caldwell, David Wild, and myself. I'm David Lloyd, and we were all on the same street there.
Oh, interesting.
That's just as a point of information.
Yeah.
You may like to just check that out.
Yeah.
Was in fact John? Was he actually the city planner of Chicago?
Planning
I'm
officer.
not sure about that. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, hi, thank you for your lecture. Enjoyed it. I was under the impression once the ex-students or the servicemen came back, they had a special examination in order not to sit the full 5 years. They could sit 2 years.
As much as I know, there was a reduction possible, but it was 4 years.
4 years.
Yes,
Okay, and
for some of them.
just to follow up, how many students from the aid actually passed away during the war? And were the students who came back affected by their lost comrades? And
I don't have these
You don't know.
information. I wouldn't know.
All right, okay.
Sorry.
In the library upstairs that was set up as a memorial library to First World War
Yeah.
students and members in Supply with the names, but I don't, and also the Second World War, but I don't know if it distinguishes who's a student and who's a member.
All right.
To get up probably somewhere.
And the AA journal through the 1940s
Yes.
often put notices in saying someone has been killed in action or is missing or whatever.
Yes.
I could just add a footnote to stories about John Caldwell. Talking to his son last year, he reminded me that John was, in fact, as you rightly pointed out, he was a prisoner of war for about three or 4 years. But John was a good forger, and he forged all sorts of passports to enable people to make their escape.
Apparently, the character that Donald Pleasance plays in The Great Escape is allegedly based on John Caldwell. So he was, I don't know whether that's true, but he definitely was in that camp where The Great Escape happened, together with Frank Knight, another AA student. It ends with William Allen, with including of William Allen. So yeah, up until 1965.
Because I think it's very, I mean, looking at all the politics and somebody remarked on the cyclical nature of it all. I mean, you can make parallels with what happens in the 60s and the 70s when students get full voting power.
Yes.
And the creation of all these different mythologies from different generations going on right through to the present, where the years of Zaha and Rem mythologized here now. And I'm sure that would be an incredibly fruitful way of looking.
Yeah, I'm planning on this occupying me for the rest of my life, really.
I thought so.
Is that the thesis you're referring to?
Yeah, up until 1965, yes. And I'll do the rest afterwards. Okay?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Anyway, it's
You're welcome.
wonderfully I believe we've got some drinks in the back room there. We've got some material laid out on the tables here from the AA archives, some of the work for the Stevenage project that Patrick talked about, some material from the library, which I think Ellen wants to
Yeah, please do come up and have a look at the material we've got out in the library, including school prospectuses from the 1940s and 50s, copies of Plan and Focus magazine, which Patrick referred to, and also various photographs. I think Christopher wanted to look at one of the photographs in particular, because you might be able to recognise some of the, maybe you're in the photograph, and further prints of student drawings by Oliver Cox and others from the late 40s. So help yourself to drinks, and please come up and have a look at it.
Any good? Oh, good. Amazing. Oh, thank you. Thank you.